invite me to be here. Actually, it is my first time in Pakistan and in Islamabad. I'm greatly honored and privileged to be here in this great friendly country and with friendly people. I was given the topic to talk about forecasting the upcoming global threats of irregular warfare. However, I am actually history majored, so I would like to go back in history and to talk about irregular warfare that actually begins with together with the beginning of the war. In China, there are two important classics, and one of that is, as you probably know, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. He said famously that subduing the enemy without fighting is the best of the best. From the very beginning in China, in Chinese culture and Chinese history, we believe that fighting is the last resort. And in today's terms, conventional war is actually destructive and in no one's good. So we believe the best way to achieve political object and also to achieve victory is through various means, particularly strategic designing to achieve the victory, not going to battleground with the other party. And secondly, I want to mention Confucius, which he famously said that learning the new by reviewing the old. So also in Chinese history, we have a quite long history. We would like to go back in history, review what happened, and learn from it. And because of the long and particularly suffering history of modern China, we have learned a lot about irregular warfare besides the real war that is facing us and that's been threatening China's security. So there are two things before I begin going down my list. First of all, I want to talk about just following the general's description of today's world. I think he's right to point out that we're all facing the threat of irregular warfare, but at the same time, standing in China's position, we're also facing growing threat of conventional warfare. If you look at today's world, total military budget is continue to rise, and also if you look at the military budget of the U.S., particularly after President Trump took office, is rising dramatically as well. And the new national security strategy from the U.S. calling China and Russia strategic rivals, and also naming China as a revisionist power. To counter China and Russia's influence, the solution for the U.S. is actually increasing budget to buy big item military hardware instead of going to sort of more discreet irregular warfare. So I think if you look at China's today's situation, from the North Korean situation, from Taiwan Strait, from South China Sea all the way down to the Indian Ocean, we're facing growing threats from the United States against our national interest. So in that respect, we have to maintain vigilance and also maintain a strategic posture in terms of conventional warfare. That said, however, I would say that irregular warfare is also very much a concern for today's China. Because, as you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's national strategy. And also, inside of it, I think the flagship, as you all know, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the flagship of this whole project. So I think it's very important for China to be aware of the risks and the threats towards the Belt and Road Initiative, and in particular, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So I think we have to weigh both conventional and unconventional, regular and irregular war on the same way and pay attention to both. At the same time, in today's particular conference, we focus on the irregular warfare. Listening to the previous speakers, I think they've covered the definition and explained the content of irregular warfare quite thoroughly. So I have very little to add to that. I will review some of the history and go into forecasting, even though I'm not really good at it. First of all, I want to remind everybody that irregular warfare, we should treat that in neutral term instead of a negative term, because anybody, and also nation state, can use irregular warfare as a defensive mechanism. You know, other countries can use irregular warfare to attack us, but we can also defend ourselves using irregular tools and measures. Particularly in China's writings about 10 years back, talking about asymmetric warfare, the weak state can use various means to defend itself and to leverage itself limited resource against big countries. So I think in many ways we have to bear in mind that irregular warfare, even though we face a lot of those threats, we can also use that against our enemies. And secondly, I think we should limit the definition of irregular warfare. We cannot expand the definition too broad. Otherwise, we risk of bringing some of the gray zone and very ambiguous actors and pushing them into our real enemies. So I think, you know, in many respects, particularly in terms of counterterrorism, we have to be aware of, you know, different social, political, economic problems, and not to define them as enemy in warfare terms too quickly. Okay, so a little bit about the traditional ways of irregular warfare. There are many definitions in Western and also in Chinese and in Russian literature talking about irregular warfare. They use the name of unrestricted war or hybrid war, asymmetric war, new generation wars. A lot of people are aware of that between peace and war there's a gray zone, and a lot of measures can be used to achieve political objectives. And in 2015, the United States Special Forces Command issued a definition of the political warfare, and it says that a spectrum of activities associated with diplomatic, economic engagements, security sector assistance, and form of conventional warfare, and information and influence activities. So as you can see, there are a couple of key points in this definition, including various aspects, diplomatic, economic, and informational. So I think if you think about that, and also combining that with today's reality, you realize that you know, they can do a couple of things, including planting political conflict, weakening government, state governance, destabilize social system, and also disrupt economic functions, just like Dr. Khan just mentioned. And also, so I would like to use a model, sort of framework to explain the traditional way of interpreting irregular warfare, which includes political, propaganda, military, and economic aspects. So the political aspects, using today's world, we can see a lot of examples. For instance, diplomatic ways of imposing irregular warfare, including diplomatic isolation, as the United States used against North Korea and Russia today, and intimidation, expulsion of diplomats, hostile alliance. They've been a lot of countries trying to use some of or combine measures against one country, trying to isolate them. And also, if you look at the other aspect, that's the international part of it. And then internally, the internal interference is also a big part of irregular warfare, that including support opposition parties, unions, different groups, grassroots movements, and also promoting so-called color revolution, I call it color coup, in different countries, including, for instance, the Arab Spring is a big part of it. And then the propaganda part of it, some people call it information influence or information activities. During the World War II, and then even after that, during Cold War and even post-Cold War eras, governments used a lot of publications, broadcasting tools to influence other countries domestically. That includes, VOA, RFE, all kinds of that publication. And then there's psychological and artistic influence. Psychological including temporal spatial superiority, particularly the Western media. If you think about that, they have the advantage of reporting first and reporting with real-life footage. And that gave them the superiority of occupying the so-called truth and also the authenticity of the information. So I think that will take a very strong psychological impact on the society, because if you come late and you give the information late, the first one that expand their information tend to stick to the reality, to be sort of explaining themselves as reality. And latecomers has a hard time to overthrow the first narrative and to give their own narrative as the real truth. And also artistic support. In many cases, and particularly in China, you can find a lot of, and also I think in Russia, a lot of opposition, like authors and artists being supported by foreign sources, and they gave subversive expression of literature, of satire, and also they're sort of destructive to the conventional values of the society. So that's harmful to the fabric of the conventional value, and that's weakened the support of the government. So that has a very strong subversive power. The military one, I think the generals probably knows more than I do. That includes special operations and like offensive exercises just near your door, and also the military overthrow of legitimate government. That happened during the Cold War, and today there's to influence and ultimately contribute to the turning of events during elections, and then that ultimately leads to the downfall of the government. And finally, there's technological disruptions. As we have experienced, for instance, before, the GPS is in control of in the hands of the U.S. And in the time of war and in the time of critical moments, they can cut off service, the GPS service, and also satellite service, and also cell phone service and other electronic activities. So that is very dangerous when you think about your independence that can be disrupted during wartime. And also during regular time, they can use this technique to have their influence and stop your influence. The economic side also been mentioned just now. I think one of the key tools is to give or cut aids. On the one hand, if you gave aids to support friendly parties and countries, that will enhance their ability. And then, on the other hand, if you have given a large amount of aids and then all of a sudden you threat to cut off those aids, that's a threat to national security. For instance, during the war in Afghanistan in the late 1970s and 1980s, altogether the United States gave about $2 billion to support the insurgency in Afghanistan, and that leads to the result is that actually in 1992, Afghanistan has more weapons than other countries in South Asia combined. So that leads to the disturbance in the country up until today. And also the second one is trade sanctions. Today, China is still under the sanction, the export control called Wassenaar Agreement. That's one of the things happened, for instance, the U.S. threat to shut down a Chinese company called ZTE. One of the reasons is that China has no ability to produce the most advanced chips in the cell phones and other electronic, like computers and other electronics. One of the reasons is that because of this Wassenaar Agreement, this technology export control, China cannot acquire the world's most advanced technology. So we have to buy, for instance, $100 billion worth of chips almost every year. And also North Korea, of course, now under a lot of restrictions the latest UN sanctions put North Korea in a position that not only they cannot acquire technology, they cannot even acquire energy like crude oil and other refined products. They cannot also export. They keep exporting goods like coal and fishery products. And the third one is financial sanction. I think that one has been imposed on Russia after the incident of Crimea, and also the United States using that regularly against other countries like Iran and Venezuela. After JCPOA, there's a resumption of financial sanction against Iran, and we'll see the outcome of that in the near future. Finally, there's financial disruption and divest of FDI. A lot of multinational companies, even though they're multinational, but actually they're under the control of nation states. So once the nation state decide that can steer their clear of certain countries, they will pull their investment out. That will leave a huge amount of negative impact on a particular state. So after reviewing the recent history of what happened and what can be used in the irregular warfare, I think there are a couple of things that will continue to happen and expand in tomorrow's world. So that's a little bit of forecasting. Number one, the non-state actors will continue to play a very important role in tomorrow's world. Even though nation-state is still very important and is still very powerful in control of every aspect of today's life, but then because of the technological advancement and also globalization, we've seen a lot of non-state actors, including individuals, groups, transnational networks, particularly terrorist networks, and corporations, foundations, and even think tanks, very powerful think tanks. They have influence, and they can actually take actions in many cases against a nation state or against certain part of the nation state. So they're growingly more and more becoming active actors in the global arena, pursuing their own interests and agenda that has a positive or negative impact upon state. So we have to be aware of those influences. And secondly, there are discrete forces and means that is working today. What I refer to mostly is the technological advancement that I think just now the General mentioned, that including unmanned systems and also AI development and also blockchain. Those are the new technologies. The potential and the ramification of the development of those technologies are still not very clear. However, we've already seen the implication of their military use. A lot of those technologies are dual-use technologies, but when you combine, for instance, AI, big data, with unmanned combat systems, they have huge impact on the battlefield of the war, and they can reduce human suffering on the one side, but inflict bigger human suffering on the other side. And they make war easier and more acceptable on the one hand, but then they will have a very intimidating effect on the other side. So I think with the growing development of technology, we will see in the next 5 to 10 years a revolution of warfare, particularly in the high-tech war. There will be different applications of this, and the military will change accordingly, not only the way of fighting, the way of combat, but also the command system and also the financial system, how to financing those wars. And if those technology falls to the hands of, for instance, non-state actors, there will be more consequences because they are less constrained by the nation states. And also the third one is the expanding cyberspace that has been militarized, and particularly through manipulated polarization. I think this topic has also been mentioned, but I want to emphasize that racial, ethnic, religious, and also income, gender, and history. In many ways, all the identity politics can be used in many ways, particularly through the technology I've mentioned, by online actors, that they can manipulate using data voters and change elections as a result. And that will militarize cyberspace and polarize society. this kind of virtual war can easily turn into a real war and putting people on the street fighting with each other. Not only, I mean, even if you're in a democracy, that will destabilize democracy and make it more likely to go to real wars. And also the fake news has been mentioned. I think the fake news, on the one hand, can be used against other countries, but here I want to emphasize actually fake news being used domestically to influence domestic support and change domestic opinion for support or opposition for certain foreign policies. For instance, I mean, if in domestic media, I will use the example in China, when they paint certain events and certain foreign countries as, put them into confusion or stress or scare or suspicion or repulsion, I mean, that will invoke a very strong emotional response from the populace. So that will change, actually, the people's support of certain things, certain project internationally, or change their attitudes against one country or another, one group of people or another, or even one religion or another. I'll talk more about that later, just a minute. And also, for China and other countries, the maritime and space is being semi-militarized. I think this point has been mentioned, and for China is particularly important, and for other countries it's also risky, because if you think about maritime space, I mean, the United States on the one hand are saying South China Sea, for instance, is being militarized by China, but actually they're the ones who started the process of encouraging people to occupy more islands and militarize the small, island features in South China Sea. And China responded by enforcing and, claiming its own sovereignty. And then in response, the United States using that as an excuse to more militarize the region, actually destabilizing the whole region and attracting other Southeast Asia countries into a tighter military bond with the United States against China. So I think in that respect, it's more dangerous in South China Sea, in other maritime areas, when the U.S. is executing so-called freedom of navigation exercise, because that could very much lead to frictions and then direct, even though it's limited conflict. Right now, both sides are not talking about full-scale war, but on the U.S. side, there are people mentioning recently that they have the ability to take islands. So that is a very dangerous statement, I think, from the U.S. side, and we have to be very careful about that. So combine this, I think I can use something called 3M to describe the trend of the irregular warfare in the near future. The first one is multi-layer actors. As I said, there are state multilateral organizations, non-state actors. They're combining together and acting in the same arena. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish which one is acting and who's behind what. So you're now facing a multi-layer actors situation. And then you have multi-assaults combined at the same time. You not only have to face diplomatic, political, but also economic and informational attack at the same time. And thirdly, you have multimedia ascension, which means that now with broader and faster internet, you can not only have papers, reading material, but you can have pictures, and even more, you can have videos. And all those sort of new media added to the confusion and creating the space for people to manipulate. Very fast. So lastly, the threat to the U.S. is using now the Indo-Pacific as a new strategy, and they're creating building blocks and contributing to that. And we can see, particularly from China's perspective, this Indo-Pacific strategy is specifically designed to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative in many ways. And then in China's western provinces, particularly Xinjiang, we face terrorist threat and misinformation. And if you look back, particularly last year and earlier this year, there's a lot of misinformation to describe what's happening in Xinjiang, and also creating sort of resistance not only among Uyghurs but also other ethnic groups like Tajiks and also other sort of minority groups in Xinjiang area. And thirdly, there's smear campaign against Muslims, Islamic regions, foreign aid investment within China. So there are a lot of papers circulating in China's social media, warning Chinese people against traveling or investing or being friendly or going to trade with Muslim countries and Islamic region overall. Because if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, that plays a very important part of it. And also finally, the sanction regimes and alternative financing. The U.S. has said that they will create alternative financing to China's Belt and Road Initiative, even though there's no concrete promise of how much money they will invest. But then they use that as an alternative source and then criticize China's standards. Okay, I'll stop here and thank you for listening to me. Hopefully I can come back soon. Thank you.